Hi there, welcome. I'm Mark Vickness. Welcome to my humble little studio, and thank you so much for checking out this video on musical composition for fingerstyle guitar players. Just a minute about me. I've been involved in music for over 50 years. I'm primarily a guitarist, but I was trained early on piano, and I've learned some non-Western instruments along the way. I've also been very lucky to have studied composition with a guy named Mel Powell, who went on to win a Pulitzer Prize in composition. And why spend the time to make this series of videos? Along the years here, I have interacted with guitar players of varying skill levels from really all around the world. And it feels to me like there is really a need to have somebody who's had decades of experience on guitar in a whole bunch of different styles address composition for guitarists. And the reason for that is that the guitar is a fairly unique instrument in that it lends itself very easily to being able to make music. However, it's an instrument where you don't really need to know much about music in order to be making music. So that has both the tremendous benefit of enabling lots of people to participate in making music with a guitar. It has, on the other hand, the detriment that when people get serious about guitar and want to start writing music on guitar or playing more complex music on guitar, they're frequently frustrated because they have not had the same kind of training that, for instance, a clarinet player or a violin player would normally get just in the course of learning their instrument. So that many guitar players are out there actually playing gigs, and if you ask them to show every E flat on the instrument, they very well may not be able to do that, which you would be hard-pressed to find a clarinet player or a violin player who couldn't play you all the E flats on their instrument instantly. So I am very fortunate to have been involved in music for many, many decades, and this is just a way for me to give something back if I can help any of you out there to write a better piece of music or to play your instrument better. Just feels like the right thing to do. So, okay, let's jump in. I'm a firm believer in good definitions so that we've got concepts in our mind as we're proceeding through this. So let's start with the biggest definition of all, which is what is music, since that's what we're talking about. You would be amazed at the variety of answers you will get to that question if you ask a room full of guitar players. So I'm going to ask you, for the purposes here of this video, to accept this definition of music, which is music is sound organized by a human mind. Now, I can already hear people who are animal lovers commenting and screaming at their screens that what's the matter with this guy? Hasn't he ever heard the record of humpback whales singing? Doesn't he ever listen to birds singing in the morning? Or hasn't he ever listened to a waterfall? And the answer is I've listened to all those things, and I find all those things to be tremendously musical and extremely pleasing to listen to. But just because something is musical does not necessarily make it music. So I'm just going to ask you to take the leap of faith and accept my definition. I think it'll be helpful as we go through this. So if we have sound organized by a human mind, let's talk about the two fundamental elements of music. So what does music consist of? Well, it consists of time and pitch, or time and sound. Only one of those is actually an essential component of music, and that is time. What do I mean by an essential component? Essential means the thing without which you cannot have music at all. So you don't need to have sound, or pitch rather, to have music, but you must have time. Let me give you a quick example of that. So time manifests itself in a whole bunch of ways in music: accent, tempo, form itself, which we're talking about in this video, is a manifestation of time, of rhythm as it expresses itself over an entire piece. You'll hear a lot of people saying that melody, which is an element of pitch we're going to get to in a second, is sort of the most important thing and the essential thing and the thing you got to have. As that example hopefully made the point, there's no pitches in that example, there's no melody, it's just percussion music, and there is a ton of wonderful percussion music all over the world that has nothing to do with melody. So although melody is really critical when we do have pitch involved, it is really not the essential thing. Okay, let's go ahead then and talk about the element of pitch. So pitch then breaks down into two sub-elements: melody and harmony. And here we go with the definitions again. Melody is defined as two or more pitches that occur successively, one after the other. Harmony is defined as two or more pitches that occur simultaneously. So let me just give you a quick example. So that's melody, and there it is as a harmony. All right, so let's jump into musical form. What I'd like you to do is to think of form as either the skeleton, the bones that you're hanging your piece on, or the way I really like to think about form is as the road that you're taking your listener down. Some roads, as you know, are just pothole filled, horrible sharp curves all over the place, hard to navigate, lots of traffic, not roads that we really want to spend a lot of time on. And other roads are just really lovely roads that we want to come back and travel many times. So that's the kind of road we want to build with our compositions. And let's start with the definition. Form is perceived differentiation. If you only take one thing from this video, please take that definition. So what do we mean by perceived differentiation? Well, perceived means we use our senses and we can perceive changes. In this case, we're talking about musical sound, so it is the ability to hear differentiation, meaning differences. All right, so this sounds obvious, but how is this accomplished in music? Well, it is accomplished by the interaction of opposite musical parameters. What do we mean by this? Let me show you a list of musical parameters. All right, so let me just pause for a minute and go over this list of differentiating parameters just so we understand each other. The first one on the list is sound versus silence. That is the most powerful differentiator in music, which is why it's number one on the list. The second one is fast versus slow. This is referencing tempo. So it's very easy to differentiate sections of music by shifting from a very fast tempo to a slower tempo. High-low is a pitch parameter. So you can have sections of music that focus on very high note textures versus bass note textures. Next we have long-short, which refers to the duration of individual notes. So obviously shorter notes and longer notes have a very different feel to them. Next we have thick versus thin. This references the concept of texture. So you can have textures which involve only, for instance, a single solo instrument, a solo oboe melody, for instance, versus textures that involve lots of instruments interacting, so you get a very thick sound. Next, we have loud soft. So loud soft is the parameter of dynamics, which everyone is familiar with. It's a super powerful method for differentiation. Then we have staccato versus legato. These terms mean staccato, very short clipped notes, versus legato, which are connected notes. So this refers to how we articulate phrases. Consonance versus dissonance is something we'll be covering in a later video. Basically, it refers to the concept of intervallic friction, meaning there are intervals such as perfect fifths, octaves, which are very low friction intervals. They're very easy on the ears. And then there are intervals such as major or minor seconds, which have very high intervallic friction. So that's a good differentiator as well. Then we have rubato versus a tempo. Rubato means without tempo. It's a sort of languid, you can't really detect a pulse, versus a tempo, which means music in which you can detect the pulse, so you can tap your feet along with it. On the beat versus syncopated rhythms are also obviously a rhythmic parameter. So music that is on the beat is following exactly along with a certain beat structure versus syncopated rhythms which are coming off the beat. And then the last one on the list is major versus minor. And again, we'll be going into this more in depth in a later video. But major versus minor really refers to chords, melodies, scales that either are based upon tonic to a major third, such as C to E, or tonic to a minor third, C to E flat. So again, this is not a complete list, but it's a good place to start regarding understanding these parameters we can use to differentiate sections. All right, so now I'm going to play you a couple of examples of how two different composers approach differentiating sections of music. The first one is from a composition by a great modern fingerstyle guitarist. His name is Andy McKee. If you have never heard him, I strongly suggest you check him out. And this is from one of my very favorite of Andy's pieces. It's a piece called Rylin. What I'm going to play you is the transition from the A section of Rylin to the B section of Rylin. And then I'm going to play you an example out of the first movement from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, in which he goes from an A section to a B section. We'll compare how these two composers approach differentiating these sections. So Andy uses two different parameters to differentiate these sections. The first is sound versus silence. The second is a tempo versus rubato, with the first section being rubato. Here, let's have a listen to that. So this is the rubato. No tempo. Silence. Now tempo. So I just want to pause for a minute before this next music is played to tell you why I would like you to listen to some Beethoven, even though we're in a video here directed to guitar players. Beethoven finished the Fifth Symphony in 1808. So here we are 211 years later. Everybody all around the world is still listening to this music and loving this music, and there's a reason for that. And that is that Beethoven not only had an amazing sense for the surface of his music, the specific notes and chords and rhythms and textures that he used, but he also was one of the strongest composers in the history of Western music in terms of putting together musical forms so that you always know where you are on the Beethoven highway, if you will. Okay, so for the Beethoven, I'm going to show you the orchestral score for the part of the symphony that we're looking at. This is the transition from the A section to the B section. Don't worry about not being able to read an orchestral score. I understand that for many of you, this might be the first time you're even looking at a score, and that's fine. So I'm just going to show you briefly what we're looking at here. This is the orchestra. We're running down flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, horns in E flat, trombones, timpani, and then the string section, violins 1, violin 2, violas, and this is cellos and basses being doubled here. So that's your whole orchestra. This is the section that we're reading. And the transition I'm going to show you is just going to go right like this. And we'll play it along with the music, and I'll move my finger along so you can see what's happening, and then we'll talk about all the ways this section is being differentiated. All right, so let's look at how this is differentiated. Remember that when we were looking at Andy McKee's violin, we had basically two differentiators, sound and silence, and rubato and a tempo. So let's see what Beethoven does here. First off, he gives us two huge chords here, and then silence, okay? So right here, you see a full bar of silence, and then after the second chord, silence, okay? So the first differentiator, the critical one, sound and silence. Next, we have thick versus thin. So look at this texture here. We have every instrument in the orchestra playing. This, in a modern orchestra, could be 100 musicians playing all together, okay? So then the two giant orchestral chords, bump, bump, and then what happens? Silence, 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 no strings at all, no timpani, no trombones. The only instrument playing now are the French horns. Okay? So there's thick versus thin. Let's look at the next one, which is dynamics, loud versus soft. Okay, so this music is all being played very loud by the orchestra. Full fortissimo is what we call it. Then the horns come in loud. This note is sforzando, which means the ictus, or the beginning of the note, should be loud. But then look what happens right here on the very last note of that horn phrase. There's this decrescendo here, and then you get this P. The P stands for piano, piano meaning soft. So fortissimo, very loud, now suddenly soft, and the strings come in with this melody. This is the B section melody, and look at the marking here. It's piano, piano, and he even says dolce is the Italian word for sweet, okay? Nothing sweet over here, so here's another differentiator. He's saying not sweet, sour, now really sweet and soft, okay? Also staccato versus legato. So all these notes are being played staccato, ta 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 ta, right? And now look at these phrase markings. These are connectors. These stand for legato phrases. And finally, another differentiator here, which is music in a minor key, C minor, now music in a major key. This is the relative major, E flat major. So Beethoven is using 5 different differentiators to separate his section 1 from his section 2. Okay, so interestingly, with this transition with the Beethoven, why does he have this horn fanfare? The da 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 da. Let's take a listen to this without the horn fanfare and see if the section differentiates. Okay, so that's the section, and it works perfectly well because you have the big chords followed by silence. You have all the other differentiators in place. Why is Beethoven bothering with this horn fanfare? So you can think of this when you compare the way Andy McKee differentiates these sections in Rylin from the way Beethoven differentiates these sections in the Fifth Symphony. If you imagine you're driving down the Andy McKee Rylin highway, Andy has basically got a nice little sign by the side of the road that says exit, next section coming up. Perfectly nice, works just fine. It's very subtle. Beethoven is not a subtle kind of a guy. So when I'm talking about structure, form, really solid bones, what Beethoven is doing on the Fifth Symphony highway when he transitions from this A section to the B section is he goes bah, bah. That's like a highway patrol officer pulling you over, banging on your window, and then while he could have just gone to the next section, he decides, no, I'm going to go ba 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 ba. So that is like the highway patrol officer essentially smacking you in the face and saying, hey, buddy, there's an exit to the next section coming up here. So that's by way of showing you how much differentiation can be done. Beethoven is very intent on making sure that everybody can follow exactly where he's going along that Fifth Symphony highway. So moving on, I want to talk for a minute about the concept of repetition as it relates to musical form. Repetition is absolutely critical, and it's one of the main ways that you as a composer or a performer can build trust with your listener. We all understand, I think, that every great relationship is built upon trust, and that is equally true for the relationship between a musician and his or her listener. So, how do you build trust in a really intimate relationship like this? Well, in music, repetition, as I said, is really key to this. There are two types of repetition, essentially. One is direct repetition, in which a musical phrase or section repeats in absolutely the same way it's already been heard. That's very common in classical music, and we'll see that in just a minute. The other way is by using the same material, it's repeated, but it's varied. That is super common. The whole idea of theme and variations is sort of well baked into not just Western music, but music all over the world. So let's look at our two examples. Again, we're going to go back to Andy McKee's Rylin and Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and see how repetition operates. All right, so looking at Rylin, here's the very first music you hear. Here's 43 seconds later. Okay, and now we're coming up to about 45 seconds later. And now we're at the end of the piece, just before the coda. Okay, so that was a good example of repeat with variation. Now we're going to take a look at the Beethoven again and listen to how he deals with just a straight repeat. So here's the opening notes. All right, and so now about a minute and a half later, here is what you're going to hear. And just so you know what that looks like in the score, we get to that end of that first section, and then you come across this double bar with these two dots, and that means go back and repeat the section. So that entire minute and a half roughly of music is going to repeat exactly in the Beethoven. All right, so in closing, just a couple of quick notes. Form can be shorthanded by the use of letters, and this is commonly done in classical music. You talk about A, B, C sections, things of that nature, and it's a handy thing to know about. Song form is normally delineated with maybe an I for intro, V for verse, C for chorus. T is normally used for transitions, and you can use this in thinking about your own compositions, looking at the form, and trying to analyze, is this a form that's working? All right, so if you want to take a look at how I approach differentiating sections, I'm just releasing a new video right now of one of the pieces off of a CD that I will be releasing hopefully spring, summer of 2020. The CD is called Interconnected. The piece is called Gray Sky, and I'll leave you a link right below here. You can take a look at it, particularly maybe look at the introduction and how each section in the introduction is differentiated, somewhat similar to what Andy does with the introduction in Rylan. So with that, I just wanted to again say thank you so much for checking out this video. I hope it's helpful to you. We've covered the definition of form, the definition of music, the definitions of melody and harmony. We've shown you a bunch of musical parameters and how they interact to create differentiation, which is what gives you a good, strong form. And with that, I'm going to let you go and make some music. Thanks a lot.